Hi guys, this is Mayur and welcome back to my channel Mayur Testing Tutorials. So today we are going to talk about software testing principles and we will look at the importance of these principles and get an in-depth understanding of these principles. Moving on. So let's look at why we need to understand these testing principles and what importance they bring to the testing process. So these principles help in adapting the right strategy of testing. This means we could have a well-planned test strategy using these principles. It also helps in achieving the goal of testing within the specified time windows. So in testing, most of the time it is carried out within a stringent or narrow time windows, and these principles could help us achieve the goal of effective testing within that stringent or specific time windows. It also helps in achieving optimum test results while conducting software testing without deviating from the goal. Now, the goal here is to achieve a bug-free or near bug-free application and find or detect a maximum number of defects within an application within a stipulated time period. So, in short, these testing principles give us a set of guidelines while planning a test, and it is very important in the testing process. So now let's look at these principles one by one and get an in-depth understanding of this. Starting with the first one, which is extensive testing is not possible. Now what is this? Right. So it is, you would have seen that it is very difficult to perform exhaustive testing of an application given the time constraint. So most of the time we have very less time window within which we have to perform the testing of the entire application. And an application has numerous scenarios. There could be thousands of those scenarios, and it is practically impossible to achieve a coverage of all the scenarios. What do we do in that case? Right? So it becomes necessary to optimize this testing based on the risk assessment of the application. So you decide the test or the test cases based on what kind of risk those scenarios bring on to the application. For example, if you consider an e-commerce app, then the likelihood of failure would be when there are multiple users accessing the application. So in this scenario, you would be performing a load testing for this application. Right, so this is what excessive testing principle talks about. So moving on to the next principle, we'll look at something called defect clustering. So what is defect clustering? It says that most of the defects are detected in a small number of modules within an application. This brings us to a very important testing terminology called the Pareto principle. Now, Pareto principle talks about 80% of the defect being found in 20% of the modules. Alright, so majority of the defects are found within a very few section of the modules within the application. What do we do here? We focus on this 20% of the modules and have a good coverage of tests for these 20% of the modules, right? But then it brings an own set of problems, which is if the same number of test cases are executed over and over again, eventually no new defects will be detected by these test cases, right? This makes sense because let's say, for example, in the first cycle we have detected 10 defects for an application within those 20% identified modules. But over the period of time, in subsequent cycles, the number of defects reduces, eventually becoming 0, which means you don't find any new defects using the existing old test cases. Now, this brings us to a new set of problems, which is addressed by the next principle called Pesticide Paradox. This says that repeating same set of tests would be ineffective in finding any new bugs. What do we do in that case? We have to continuously review and revise the test cases so that we find new bugs. What does that mean? It simply means that every time there is a change in the application, every time there is a new functionality being added to the application, you go ahead and revise the test suite. You revise the test cases and rewrite those test cases in a way that all the newly added functionalities are covered properly, right? And this can be done by adding new and different test cases regularly and not relying on older tests. Okay, so moving on, the fourth principle is testing detects defects, which means testing helps you to identify presence of defects in an application, but we never talk about absence of defects. Testing doesn't vouch for an absence of defect within an application, right? So the goal of testing here is to find defects in an application, and no amount of testing can ensure a bug-free application. What testing does? It helps reduce the defects but does not remove all the bugs, right? So no application is 100% bug free after testing, right? We cannot ensure that. Okay, let's move on to the next principle, which is absence of error fallacy. Now this is somewhat related to the fourth principle, which says we cannot ensure 100% bug free application, right? We cannot do that. What does this mean? It means that even if an application is say 99.9% bug free, and yet that application can be of no use to the clients because it does not meet the requirement, right? Your application is free, you have worked hard and you have found all the possible bugs you can from the application and you're confident. But what if it doesn't meet the client's requirement? What do we do? Right? So it is of no use, it doesn't add any value to the client, right? And that is why it becomes important for testing to verify all the application with respect to its business needs, right? We should make sure that the application meets the business requirements, the client's expectation with respect to the application is met and delivered, right? So what does this do, right? So if we say an application is 99.9% bug free, what does this mean? So it gives a perception of absence of defects, right? Which is it in itself is a fallacy, right? Because we are finding and fixing defects which is of no value if the system build is unusable and does not fulfill the client needs and requirements, right? So we may fix n number of defects on the application, but if the application doesn't meet the requirement, then that basically has no value, no use of that application to the client, right? So it becomes important to therefore validate the functional requirements of the application, right? The business needs. Okay. Moving on to the next one, it brings us to a new principle called early testing. What does this say? It says that the test should commence early in the SDLC or the software development lifecycle so that we can detect defects in the requirement and design phases, right? So we start the testing early as soon as the design or the requirement phases start, right? So we end up detecting more defects and early in the life cycle. What does this do, right? So early detection has its own advantages, right? Because you are detecting and fixing the bugs early, and which is very cost effective. It comes cheap. You don't want to be detecting a bug during the user acceptance testing phase, right? So you don't want users to detect defects because that will become a costly affair. It becomes a costly thing to fix the bug, right, in the UAT phase. So which is why ideally testing should start as soon as the requirements are defined and finalized, right? So this is what the early testing principle says, right? Moving on to the last and the final testing principle, which is testing is context dependent. What does this mean, right? So it says that software testing depends on the context of application under test, right? So you don't want to be performing the same approach of testing for different kind of applications, right? You cannot follow the same approach for a web application as you are doing it for mobile application, right? So every testing process is context dependent. It depends on the kind of application under test, right? So the kind of infrastructure being used to host that application, right? The devices on which the application will run, and so on, right? So this is what it is talking about. The test strategy should be differing from application to application. So giving an example, again, for an e-commerce application, we may require a load testing, while that may not be a priority for banking application. And it makes sense because e-commerce application, they experience heavy load during, festive season or during the time of sale, right? So but that becomes a priority for them to do a load testing, but you can't you that may not be a priority for banking application, right? So similarly, web application testing will differ from mobile application testing, right? So this is all about the different type of testing principles that we are using and that we should be aware of during the testing process, right? So these are all the testing principles that we have to keep in mind while designing the test. So literally all the test artifacts, right? may it be test cases, your test plan, test strategy, test closure report, everything, literally every test artifact revolves around these principles, right? So with this, we have come to an end of this video. Hope you have liked the video, and if yes, then please don't forget to hit the like button, and also don't forget to subscribe the channel for more informative videos related to software testing. Thank you.